So another kind of, I don't know if highlight is the right word to use, but memorable circumstance, I guess, while you were president was a fair degree of turmoil, maybe is one word to use, with our Board of Education, our school trustees. And I know there were some accusations of racism. We had a lot of program cuts threatened. There was quite a lot of pushback, both from us and from the parent community. I believe we lost a secretary treasurer during this time. So,
At least, yeah.
maybe you can describe kind of like when that began and sort of that whole episode in terms of really the governance of our school district and yeah, what took place in those years.
Yeah, it's hard to really like figure out how it all went wrong. We had school board trustees that we had endorsed, Ryan Painter, Jordan Waters. These are people that I remember Jordan coming to picket with us in 2014 when she was part of the parent advisory group and being such a strong advocate, and we endorsed her and she was elected. And Ryan Painter too, like fully endorsed by the GVTA and seemed like such a strong advocate. And then things seem to really go sideways. I mean, being a trustee is an impossible position, it seems. And I think the government seems to be doing as much as they can to make it a somewhat pointless position. If you don't have control over the finances, really, you just have to bring forward a balanced budget, regardless of the needs of the community you're representing. It's kind of impossible. So I have some sympathy for how it's gone along, but whew, what a challenging board. I think maybe the most difficult time, although secretly wonderful for me, was when the board removed two other members from the board for, I guess, letting information leak or letting information out that was supposed to be kept confidential, but they felt like they were doing the right thing, and the board voted to remove them, which the GVTA took the position, and so did the courts, that eventually that was wrong for them to be able to remove those two members. Now, what was the bonus for me is the GVTA voted that we would boycott the board meetings, and so for a little while I didn't need to attend that wild disaster that is the board meetings. And subsequently, I mean, we were highly successful in getting a board elected that were all endorsed by us. People believe teachers. That's clear. But even though we have a board now that we totally had elected, it's just such a challenging job for them. And I don't know. I think we'll have to think as we move forward what we want to do around endorsing a board and how that can be useful to us. Sometimes it's easier just to fight against them. The board.
What were the issues around the budget cuts when there were there were accusations of racism around a survey, as I recall, that was put out?
Yeah, so they wanted to cut the music program a great deal, strings in particular, and we organized a huge rally, and we, like the parents, the teachers, the music teachers, and out as part of that happening at the same time, there was a survey released by the district, and there were some slides. Oh, right. And it was the secretary treasurer that Kim Morris that was the owner of this survey and of the slides that were created around that, although she didn't create these particular slides. The particular slides suggested that Indigenous students didn't benefit from music and didn't participate in music, and this got huge backlash from the Indigenous community. Carrie Newman, who's well known and was quite involved with the school districts, that I'm not ever working for them again. That's racist. There were some board meetings. There was an ed policy meeting in particular that Ryan Painter was chairing, where the link to because everything was online, of course, that the link had been provided to some of the leaders of both the Esquimalt and the Sahis Nation, and they showed up, and he expressed concern that there were so many people there, which again was awful and racist, because the folks that were showing up were our Indigenous leaders who were there to speak about why these programs are important for their students as well. Such a time. Do you know who made the slides?
No, I don't. Yeah.
I don't know how, but we can just figure out what we need to edit. But they were made by Shelley Neamy, and it was the superintendent that phoned me to tell me, because she had concerns about how things were going.
Right, and so just for the benefit of someone watching this 20 years from now, Shelley Neamy is the
Indigenous director of the Indigenous Education Department for the school district.
Right. Yeah, so
there was, there's layers of things going on, because in lots of ways, I think that led to our secretary treasurer leaving and going on medical leave, saying that she'd been harassed and bullied by the trustees over this, and she was publicly criticized by the trustees. Although you'd think at that pay scale you'd have a pretty thick skin. But they really close ranks up there around what they'll say publicly, and I think this probably just should be for union use, but they're not all united, even if they show an outward united front. Maybe we do that too.
Yeah, so we then moved on to quite a different board of trustees. How did that happen?
Well, the GBQ is nothing but not organized, if not organized. So partly to stop the Viva candidates that were so anti-SOGI and so problematic. This parents' choice, the rise of the right has been, maybe that comes out of COVID, because I don't think of that as happening before, and or at least it feels like it's been a long time since that's the fight we had to have. And then after COVID, there seemed like there's this real rise of the right, of parent choice, of this anti-SOGI rhetoric that's been...
And just so folks know, SOGI is the
sexual orientation and gender identity, and it's just supposed to be woven through the curriculum. It's just about human rights. It's not... it shouldn't be political. It shouldn't be controversial. It's just the idea that people are different from each other, and for me,
we had a slate of, now Viva was a sort of a political grouping.
Yes, sort of very
trustee the following time
around.
So after all this sort of turmoil had happened.
And we see this real right-wing parent choice, couched as parent choice, but really anti-human rights group coming forward, and we need to organize in such a way to get a board elected that would continue to support teachers, to support students, make sure that our school communities are safe for everybody who walks through the doors, because that's what public education is fundamentally about, that it should be safe and for the public, and everybody should be able to attend school. And I think if the Viva candidates had gotten in, we would have seen some really problematic policy. Our endorsed trustees have not been perfect, but they certainly, their goals are the right things. It's just, it is again a really challenging job, because you're given a limited budget, continuous cuts, continuous pushing down by the government of underfunding of, the hydro costs go up and there's no extra money for that. And so they've just got to find those cuts somewhere. And real efforts from the current board to figure out what's happening in international education. But I think that's been a moneymaker for the district. And by really looking into that program, I think they've reduced some of the funds that came out of that program. And yeah, everything becomes
And
problematic.
maybe since we're talking about the school board, we'll just talk about one other kind of big controversial episode, which is we're still in the midst of, which is a couple of years ago, and I guess this is while you were president still, our board engaged in a process to look at whether or not to continue the police liaison officer program, and eventually made a decision to discontinue that. Do you want to just talk about that process and our involvement and how we came to take the position we did?
Yeah, I think one of the really important parts about that is we didn't end the police liaison program, and neither did the board. The police, the Vic PD, stopped funding the police liaison program. There was a big controversy between Esquimalt police and the Vic PD about who would fund it. The police chief saying that, well, all the crime, any crime gets committed in our area, so we should be higher funded, so we can't afford to fund the police liaisons. And that led to the board, I think rightfully, doing a review of the police liaison program, what are the benefits and how is it being used and what are the rules around it, and discovering that there was no terms of reference, how each of the police departments, we have the Saanich Police and the Vic PD, the Oak Bay Police, the Esquimalt, all servicing our schools, and all having very different conceptions of what the program meant and what their role was in that program. And at the same time, the BCTF engaged in a quite substantial research project looking at the impact of police liaison, particularly on Indigenous, Black, and teachers or members of the school community of color, and really reported on some of the negative outcomes of having police in our schools. And so there was that happening. And then the Human Rights Commissioner came out making a public statement about her concerns around police liaison programs and the negative impacts. And I feel like if you're siding with the Human Rights Commissioner, you're probably doing a pretty good job. I personally had quite positive experiences with our police liaison at Quadra when I was there, until the year that we got all the Syrian refugees coming into Victoria, and I had twins from Syria in grade 1, and they were terrified of people in uniform, and it really, I was like, oh, okay, you can't come to my class anymore. It's just not safe for my students. It's not safe for their mental health, which was fine. That was before the program had ended, but it had given me sort of a shift in perspective. So there was that, and then the research project from the BCTF, and then the education we did here, the work that the board did, the board, I guess, created a committee, and we had GVTA members on that committee. And we really tried to make sure that the members that we were appointing that committee were coming from a wide range of perspectives, like a high school counselor who had worked heavily with the police liaison at the high school level, and making sure that even the voices from us on that committee were representing a diversity of opinions. It's a little weird to have the police on that committee, for them to, because they're not really a member of our community in the same way as the rights holders and the stakeholders, and yet they were invited to be part of that. And I feel like that was hard for the other members of the community. How do you talk about someone's position when the person who has the position is
Sitting
there with you? That's pretty uncomfortable. But since removing the police liaison program, since taking that position, the board taking the position, feeling really like the GVTA went through an extensive process to get to that position. I felt like it was well informed, and the folks who, well, I've told people if they're not happy with the decision, they're welcome to bring it to a meeting and reconsider, and we could talk about it more, because people have different experiences with the police. But I think if we know members of our community are being harmed, we have to take that very seriously. And seeing how hard police have fought back, particularly the Vic PD. I have to say it's just been the Vic PD. How hard they've fought back against us since being removed, how awful they've been to the board chair, how powerful they seem, makes me so confident of our decision, because I had a feeling they seemed like a gang before, but watching them afterwards, and I'm not anti-police. My brother-in-law and sister-in-law are both police officers. I think there's a place for police in our society, but there's no reason to have uniformed police officers just hanging out in schools. If there's a crime being committed, please come, and they are still totally allowed to come, despite what they say in the press.
Mm-hmm. That issue sort of arose too in 2020, I think, was kind of the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And yeah, how did that politics kind of like infuse union work generally?
Well, kind of a tricky time, you know, middle of a pandemic, Black Lives Matter. Yeah. And then Trump got elected. So that was confusing. Don't let him get elected today.
Yeah, what's your perspective? I just think you were in leadership again during a period of time when those human rights issues have really come to the forefront in the union in a way that maybe they weren't 10 years ago even.
I think it's interesting looking at it through the role of the GVTA and then through the role of the BCTF. I feel, again, very lucky to be part of this teaching community. I feel like, sure, there might be some people that are a bit more conservative, but in general, pretty progressive. Like, we don't have the anti-vaxxers and the, like, every lives matter and that kind of, the GVTA building has never been picketed. And that's happened elsewhere in the province where it really, folks really had to be at odds with their community, and so I didn't feel that impact in the way that I heard from colleagues across the province. But I mean, I lost one of my closest friends over pro-SOGI rallies that I was attending, and she was so upset at me attending. I was like, I didn't realize that our divide around our like substance, like our political beliefs, were so far apart. And so there's been, you really have to figure out what you believe and what you're willing to stand for, and what you're willing not to stand for, and that's been impactful, and I think that's been impactful for our membership as well. Hopefully it'll play out in bargaining.
And then how do you see the union's role in that? Like, what is...
I see us as a social justice union. I think we have a role. I mean, I guess there's two pieces. I really do believe that the collective agreement is the backbone of the union, and we need to be protecting teachers' rights. And that is fundamentally why we are a trade union. However, we live in a context, and everything about our culture, like, it all intersects, and we need to be standing up for all of the members in our community, and in just the way that I think trade unions were part of labor laws, child labor laws, and maternity leaves and pregnancy leaves, parental rights, all of those pieces, the hours of work in a day, the hours of work in a week, like all of those things that now we take for granted and don't think of, I think, as social justice issues. Those are all social justice issues, and we have to stay at the forefront of making sure that we're advocating for our membership and leading in the community, particularly as teachers, because we're always teachers. We're always we can't ever separate ourselves from that.
Thanks, Winona.
Maybe that's what I think about that.